For decades, we're told a very specific story about who we are. We were told that our DNA was a blueprint, a fixed architectural plan written in stone before we took our first breath. Now, if that were true, then our fate would be sealed the moment we were conceived. But what if the story is wrong? What if your DNA isn't a dictator, but a listener? Welcome to the DNA of Things. I'm Dr. Jeremy Koenig. Today, we are joined by Dr. Neal Kitchen, the COO of Epimorphy, which is a subsidiary of Zymo Research. And they are on the precipice here and now to launch the LIVE platform, the first of its kind, comprehensive multi-omics insight into our human biology. Now, Neal isn't just a biochemist pioneering the frontiers of epigenetics and the microbiome. He is a living experiment. As an identical twin, he shares a genetic code with his brother. Yet their lives, health, and biological expressions have diverged quite significantly. This paradox reveals the hidden thread of today's conversation. Biology is not destiny, it is dialogue. In this episode, we move beyond the reductionist view of the genome as a static instruction manual. We explore the concept of scientific wellness, a theme we've touched on with guests like Dr. Nathan Price and Dr. Lee Hood. But Neal now takes this a step further. He asks us to consider our bodies as, responsive ecosystems that are constantly eavesdropping on our thoughts, our environments, and our choices. We discuss how to move from fearing our data to conversing with it. And the future of the LIVE platform is what that's meant to facilitate, and why our biology is arguably the most important conversation you will ever have. Dr. Neal Kitchen is a biochemist, entrepreneur, and visionary leader shaping the frontier of personalized health through epigenetics and multi-omics integration, not least of all microbiomics. As the COO, Chief Operating Officer at LIVE, Neal is pioneering platforms that bridge genetics, epigenetics, and the microbiome, translating complex biological data into actionable wellness insights, bringing together biological testing, supplementation, and community engagement to empower individuals to live in alignment with their biology. So, guided by his belief that science should serve the whole human story, Dr. Kitchen's work reflects the ethos here at the DNA of Things to illuminate how innovation and empathy merge to expand on our human potential. His vision for precision health is both deeply technical and profoundly human, and one that connects data to purpose, biology to belonging. So, Dr. Neal Kitchen, thank you so much for joining me today, and long overdue on the DNA of Things.
Well, you always said I was your second best fan. Never going to take that from your wife, but it's been a lot of fun to see how the DNA of Things has created over the. I think I first reached out to you after your 52nd or your full year episode, and that was when we first connected. But it's been a lot of fun to interact and to become friends.
Amazing. Absolutely, for sure. And to, become friends of friends and to connect to so many like-minded people. Like we were just talking about Sean Gibbons, Mike Polcari, all future alum. Mike actually was at the Biomarkers of Aging conference. And I think there was you, Ragav, Mike. I want to say there's one of those, Tom. I think he was there also in epigenetics kind of life insurance industry space. Yeah. Mike said, there was a whole DNA and Things alum there. It's pretty cool.
It really was. It was awesome.
Yeah. And, it was funny. You mentioned my number one fan, Kristen. I was just, commenting to her last night where, oftentimes people ask me, why are you doing this thing? And I was like, I don't know, but I said I would do 100 episodes. So let's just see. And, first of all, to find somebody like you who's like, hey, I've listened to every episode and here's some people I think you should have on. I was like, wow, I guess that's a reason why I'm doing it. And then just as recently as yesterday, I got an email from one of my alum, Kristen, who was a grad student, undergrad, now turned grad student. And, she was recommended by her professor who had written a book on a CRISPR-Cas9, really more of a fiction book, but she had recommended her grad student, Kristen. Anyway, Kristen reached out night, and she said, hey, I wanted to reconnect and say I've been listening to all your episodes, and I've now started my master's degree, and oh, by the way, my colleague he's doing grad school, he loves the show, and he wanted to connect with you to kind of pick your brain on where he thinks he might um, focus his energy in his career, and I'm happy to listen. My wife said something like, see, that's what you're really good at. And I was like, well, I don't have the answers. I can just listen. So,
Yeah.
but it's amazing to get to listen to people like you who, and all those that I just mentioned and all those that have come before on this incredible future that is being built around, our self-knowledge as humans and collectively, and just through so many, layers, and making the unseen seen, let's say. And so I'm delighted to hear more about, your story, because we actually have connected on, some potential collaborations, but I don't have the actually kind of deep dive in terms of, how it is that you've got to really be, spearheading what's going on at Live and Zymo, both things that I think, well, Live is a very new thing. Zymo was new to me, but as I started to look, I was like, whoa, like what Dr. Jaw's done there is pretty amazing. And so, of course, I want to learn about that and that broader ecosystem that's coming from that. But you've got a pretty impressive background in terms of, your biochemistry, let's say formal education, but you played in the, direct to consumer, I think, microbiome, skin health. So I'd really love to, and I think you have a twin, right? Yes.
I do.
You're my second guest. It's a twin, the Roos brothers.
And I did know that because I've listened to every episode. But again, I even purchased the CRISPR fictional book for my daughter to read. So she's been reading that.
No way. Okay, so it's happening. The DNA of things is
happening. In full honesty, the launch of your podcast was actually very instrumental in my kind of career path, and where I've kind of taken my next step in my next journey with Epimorphy and all that connection. Amazing. So I can't, say enough of that. I appreciate what you've created here, even though, like you said, it's been a journey for you. I think the thing that's been most fun for me is the connections that we've been able to make, both in the context of the science, but also in the, connections and collaborations that we've been able to do.
100%.
But to give you a little bit of an origin story as well.
Let's hear it. I actually, just one thing that I'll put a pin in, I'd like to revisit at the end is, what would happen if all of these people came together on some kind of type of a colloquium type of thing? I didn't actually do too much prep work ahead of time on that, but if we have time to come back to something like that, I have been asking folks like, Nathan Price and Lee Hood and others, like, there's a lot of information out there. What if we could iterate ideal company product with the ideal customer in a very short amount of time? What problems might we solve? But anyway, before we get to that, yes, let's hear the origin story, because you've been through some twists and turns, and that's what makes these episodes so fun. So over to you, Doc.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Yeah, you mentioned it, but I think I'll kind of just start here. I've always viewed biology through the lens of being an identical twin. It's part of who I am. Great relationship with my twin brother, Dale, and he's a great guy. And, I think that, growing up, the idea of having someone that you share your same DNA with, it changes the way that you go about life. We were known as the twins growing up, and from the get-go, that was part of who we were. But there was also this interesting nuance that there was always a difference between us, even though we had that same DNA. For example, even in childhood, he's always been about 3 inches taller than me. And I always teased him that he got the height and I got the good looks. And I even played up to that story when I went into the skincare industry, because that was, a fun way to kind of describe it when you talk about epigenetics. But it is interesting because growing up as an identical twin is like living inside a living experiment, and it still is for us. We've done and shared different tools and tips and tricks, biohacks that we've done, and trying to understand different nuances of what makes us different now, what makes us even more alike now, and so it's kind of fun to have that living experience, because it creates not only an N of one journey for myself, but I've got this other person that says, hey, why don't you try doing this too? Or he does the same with me. And this is all, of course, even before I knew what epigenetics was. I could feel there was something beyond DNA that was shaping who we were becoming. I guess that curiosity of the question of why identical isn't exactly identical eventually led me into molecular biology, and later into epigenetics, where I discovered the framework that could finally explain what I've been sensing my whole life, that we're not static blueprints, we're dynamic biological stories. And that's really been part of the framework of some of the storytelling that I have used within any of the D2C or the direct-to-consumer experience. Of how do you explain epigenetics to a consumer in a way that they can, really understand that and appreciate it? So, I didn't really go into molecular biology from the get-go. It was actually first a close friend who developed type 1 diabetes when we were in college. And I took a biology class and decided to do like a general ed biology class. And I did a paper on type 1 diabetes, and it just kind of floored me. And I became hooked into the molecular biology, immunology space. But then when I went to school and discovered epigenetics in graduate school, that's when I said, okay, this is my sweet spot. This really goes into who I am. It's about my identity. I can talk and understand better why an identical twin has differences and how those differences can ebb and flow based on our environment, our lifestyle. Ultimately, it's that understanding that gave me purpose to make the invisible processes visible and meaningful to myself and to everyday people.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's just interesting as I've reflected for this podcast on my career path. That's been quite fascinating for me as well, because, like I said, I kind of got into falling in love with molecular biology by studying type 1 diabetes, but then I kind of pivoted into this epigenetic space. But I always knew I wanted to go more into the industry than into academia. And so I took the opportunity. When I finished graduate school, I was actually during the housing crisis. And so there was I would say there was a dearth in opportunities, but I ended up taking a technical support role at Thermo Fisher Scientific, not a glamorous position, but it was I'm so grateful that I opted to do that, because it gave me the insight I needed into understanding the dynamics of how a business is run, how a biotech company would run things. And with technical support, I actually got to work with the R&D scientists. I got to work with the marketing department, the quality control department. And the other key reason why I actually went to Thermo Fisher is they were one of the few companies that was still offering to provide funding for schooling. And I went ahead and got my MBA while I was there. And so it was kind of a really fun experience. I thought that was going to be kind of my career trajectory, that I was going to stay in the life science space and work for a large company like Thermo Fisher. And I loved my time there, but I had this unique opportunity where my sister had been in skincare all the years that I had known her. And we had this kind of surreal moment it would have been Christmas of 2012, where she had just joined as a managing partner to a new company. She had sold off a company that she had developed in skincare and was joining another one. And I said, well, what's the name of the company? She said, Hydropeptide. And I kind of remember doing a double take and saying, Hydro what? And she said, peptide. And I was like, I didn't even know you knew what a peptide was. And we just had this kind of surreal moment where our lives kind of collided on the work front. And she got super excited when I told her that I had done a lot of work with peptides and peptide signaling, and that, this whole idea that anti-aging within the skincare space really needs to talk about how that works at the fundamental level, at the molecular level through epigenetics. And one thing led to another, but I opted to take a, industry leap of going from life science industry into the cosmetic space and the D2C space, and ended up doing that for, over a decade, working at Hydropeptide. And it was really that opportunity to kind of help me understand, how do you bring science and tell the story of science to the consumer in a meaningful way, so that they can understand how this is working and why it matters to them. Skincare industry is kind of an obvious place where the story of epigenetics and how it works should be an absolute integral part of it. But when I joined Hydropeptide in 2014, there were very few companies that were talking about epigenetics. So it was really fun to see over the last 10 years how that's changed, and how, even within the skincare and cosmetic space, you see a lot more understanding of how you use epigenetics to improve health and longevity, to improve the resiliency of your skin. And it's through that molecular lens that you have to look at it, both in product development and in just the way that you frame, how am I going to tackle keeping myself looking youthful as I get older?
Amazing. Hey, quick question on the twin stuff, because I got, to see that up close when I was doing my postdoc stuff at Cornell and our collaboration with King's College London and Twins UK. And I think they had 500 twin pairs. And we actually I set up their that project, that NIH funding project, to pair the microbiome, gut microbiome analysis with the human genome analysis. And, interesting, point there that you're living out, an N of two, really, which is really cool. When you look, are you at a point where you can compare or have compared the epigenetics profiles between you and your brother? Like, have you looked at that, and what is interesting or useful if that's the case?
Yeah, great question. And it's certainly something that we've been working on in the past since I joined Epimorphy. And of course, we've done our biological age test. We've started doing some internal samples for gut microbiome and analyzing that. It's interesting too, because my twin Dale has been vegan since I think about 2017. And I've done some level of modified vegan diets where I always used to call it the 80-20 rule, where 80% of my diet's vegan. But within that, it's been really interesting for us to start looking and unearthing, subtle differences. A key and one that we've just been talking about is we had continuous glucose monitors that we were using to do some of our measurements. And I actually had I was less sensitive to the response, and I had a little bit higher levels of glucose. And we were talking through, what could cause that and everything. And I really actually pinned it to years of drinking Diet Coke that I was doing where he wasn't. And, part of that was unlocking it in that sense of just knowing what had he eliminated from his diet completely versus what I had in my diet. And so, the last 6 months, I don't think I've had a diet soda in quite a long time now because of that. And I'm really curious to retest some of that to see how much does that get me back to the baseline where I was consuming his as the baseline in that context. But it's also helped us do a lot of other fun things. He introduced me this year to cold plunging, for example. And, in previous, we did end up 2 experiments with, sit-ups and push-ups and workouts and different routines that have helped us both kind of adapt and understand, different layers of what makes us tick. And so your idea of an N of 2 journey is definitely been something we've been putting to practice over the years.
So when you compare, there's actually one thing that's interesting there when you say the glucose, continuous glucose monitoring and the insulin response. I remember that was something that in postgraduate school, we were interested in as well, like not epigenetically, but it was copy number variation of salivary amylase, right? And so basically it would that basically turns your low glycemic index sugar into a high glycemic index sugar, the more the starch that you break down in your mouth, for example. So the speed of accessibility of the simple sugars. And so I didn't really think about, obviously your ability to rapidly metabolize sugars is going to lead to a more rapid rate of release of that simple sugar and higher amounts of it potentially rather than a slow release. Especially if you're vegan, it might be, tougher to, balance the carb. I've played with all kinds of different diets. I found vegan the most difficult one to do, like fully healthfully. Because then at a certain point, maybe I would get lazy and say, "Oh, well, that's vegan," and then go. And it's like, well, vegan doesn't equal good, and so it's like a lot of like
nice and beer when you vegan,
bread.
but,
yeah, no, but So it's interesting to think, and I actually kind of noticed this also when I would do, kind of changing, and I've actually integrated this into my, like bringing in enough variation in my workout to ensure versatility, but then also pairing that functionally with my nutrition. And one of the things that I noticed is there's a kind of a lag when I would, in particular, switch if I too drastically between the ratios, macronutrients. You can imagine being in the most extreme instance, if you're just pure carbohydrate and then switching to, and so you're primed, you're ready, you're fully expressed and optimized for carbohydrates genetically, epigenetically, let's say. But then if you were to throw in, pure protein or carnivore or ketogenic right away, I think there's some efficiencies there that have not yet been realized because you've got all the kind of residual enzymes hanging around ready to break down carbs, and now they're not there, and you haven't expressed the the lipases and the proteases necessary to handle the other macronutrients at the level that you're now introducing it. So I kind of stumbled upon that, and I was like, oh, I think that's like a little bit of molecular workout. It's a way of like, being actually, honestly, I think about it, a little wasteful with the calories that you consume, but that lack of efficiency, let's say, would lead to weight loss over time. Not that that was my goal, but I know I would notice that then after a time of, say more of a carnivore like that, then you get really good at that. You start to feel really good at it. I never actually measured that, quantified it. It's just kind of a working hypothesis that I had. But when it comes to the things that we're now starting to measure, which is, your glucose response, I mean, that has a massive impact on long-term health. Like I know, for example, looking at my cardiometabolic polygenic risk scores, that if everything's left in check and I do things status quo in accordance with the North American diet, I'm like 50% likely to have type 2 diabetes by the time 65, and such is the case for my father, unfortunately. And then my brothers are kind of going on that track. And I'm like, hey, here's why, here's how, here's what we can do. That's simple. And that's the really exciting thing that's starting to happen. And I want to talk a little bit about like what you're, doing with Live to actually, usher in that, what I'm calling ushering in this age of scientific wellness that Lee Hood, people like Lee Hood and Nathan Price have identified. It's here, it's real. How do we usher it in? But I did want to say a couple of things on just your time at Affymetrix. That's kind of neat. So Affymetrix, Thermo Fisher, that was after they acquired Affymetrix, right? I think it would have been, yeah. Yeah, they were a big, sponsor and partner for my Athletogen project. So, love that team. Yeah. Anyway, conversation for another day. But one thing that I would say is I think is a good springboard into Live is what you talked about insofar as like the story of science, right? And, for scientists, like when I fall too far into my, say, my left brain, I can get super technical and just think, oh, this is really cool, like from a thing type of perspective. But if I get more empathetic and more right brain, and this is actually, I think, why I got into science, was when I started reading about the scientists themselves and the problems that they were solving. It made the experiments and the technology not so onerous to learn, because some of the stuff is really complicated. But if you want to learn it, then you do. But we have to remember that most people they haven't developed a vernacular as to, your 16S library of microbes in your gut microbiome, or the metagenomic functional profile. I mean, just the fact that we can do that is so cool from a scientist's point of view. But then it's now, telling the story as to why this matters. And, one of the things we talked about at the beginning of the call was, this diagnostic odyssey that I've been on without knowing it for the last 20 years, trying to optimize all these things where I'm genetically predisposed to a inflammation pathway or aversion to certain foods as a result of, food intolerances or food allergies. But also there's like, what I was missing by going too narrow, I think too fast, was there was a big obvious thing, which was mold toxicity, which we can thank, what's his name? The guy from Bulletproof, Dave Asprey, for making very, very popular. But it was like this obvious thing, like right in front of me the whole time, which I'm grateful now that I've identified. And so, but now, like when I think about it, it's like, oh, there is a way to tell the story with, so much of this richness of life as to, why it's worth knowing at different points. And so as you're starting to build out Live, there's this multi-omics, longitudinal resource that I think is going to be valuable for people for the rest of their lives. Like I'm excited for my daughter to have something like this. I've already started to build her, her health LLM, if you will. And so when you think about the story of the science with Live specifically, I think it's really neat because you're at a very specific, customer that you're focusing on. I think it's women to start, but I'd love to, understand the story as to why that matters, because we're going to talk about microbiome, and with Live, what it is, where it's going, and, how that folds into the Zymo ecosystem. And so what is the story for somebody who could potentially benefit from what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think our belief is simple for the, ethos of what we're trying to do with the Live brand. Your health is the product of 3 interconnected systems. We've already kind of described it as your genetics, your epigenetics, and your microbiome. You've already mentioned insight that you have with your polygenic risk score analysis. That's a part of it, but obviously isn't the complete story. And if you were to go with just that pillar, you wouldn't have enough information to really understand who you are. That's why, it's been interesting with my journey with my twin brother is that, when we think about genetics and epigenetics, our genetics is identical and we can get information from that. Our epigenetics helps to understand how our lifestyle habits and things have changed that. And then probably our biggest variable that kind of distinguishes us is our microbiome. If I haven't been vegan and he has, we're going to clearly have, distinct footprints within our microbial community. And it's really, Liv is bringing those layers together through at-home molecular testing, powered by that next-gen sequencing technology that Zymo Research has really crafted and optimized the workflow for that so that we can also help drive the cost down for the consumer. One of the key things that we want to focus on, particularly with the consumer, is that to create an actionable narrative, your N-of-1 journey that we've described, you have to be able to include longitudinal modeling, which is exactly what you've described with your daughter. I think that the real problem isn't measurement, it's interpretation of that information. And we're building that Live platform to create the bridge and gap between all of the information that you can get. You can drown in numbers with your wearable information, one-off lab reports that are just a snapshot. But if you can start bringing that into a collective whole, then it starts becoming really interesting of being able to get real insights that can come from seeing what your interventions are going to actually do. One of the exciting things that we're doing within the modeling, of course, is not everyone, for example, has an identical twin to soundboard off of. And so creating that digital information, you mentioned Sean Gibbons, for example, and what he's been doing with My Digital Gut is really important because it can help us simulate what interventions will have the biggest and most beneficial impact to your overall health. So rather than you just saying, what's the latest trend, what's the latest biohack that everyone's recommending, I can actually look specifically at what are the longitudinal interventions that I can do that will have the greatest impact. And the only way you can get to that is if you have all three genetic, epigenetic, and microbiome in a holistic map that you can then better understand how can I make this actionable narrative for me that will have a bigger difference on my overall health and my chance for healthy living and longevity.
And you're starting with like a very specific audience, right? I think this year yeah. And so what does that look like and when, well, what is it and when is it? I guess is the question.
Yeah, great questions. And within the Live platform, we are focusing initially on our women's health initiative. I think, there's clear, when we look at the historical data and all the research that's been done, there's been a lack of research that's been done and to focus on women's health. A lot of times clinical studies have been done where a woman was considered a small man as far as what data information should be given to them for supplement use and other things. And the interesting thing with my career path is I have worked a lot with women's health, whether it was in skincare or now the opportunity to bring that impact specifically to women's health. So we're launching our vaginal microbiome report. We're working on a sex-specific age clock as well to really hone in on what are the differences and needs that a woman has for longevity and overall healthy living. That will be our first launches within the women's space. We'll complement that, of course, in the future with a men's health system as well that will include male microbiome reporting as well that you can get through the semen. And that will be an important next step. But that first phase is really critical as understanding that overall women's health. We oftentimes, for example, talk about the gut-brain axis. It'll be really interesting for us to interplay the gut microbiome analysis that we're doing with the vaginal microbiome and the communication that comes from that. And of course, this will impact ways that we can unlock the menopause transitions that a woman has, going from perimenopause into postmenopause, understanding what they can do to help alleviate symptoms. That's all part of our initiative right now, where a lot of our research is ongoing with that, is to really help model that out. So no matter what stage you are in, you have better understanding at that molecular level of what's going on with your body. So if you're looking, for example, in your fertility years, and you want to optimize for that first child when you're trying to get pregnant, you want to have that information at your fingertips so you can understand what do I need to change or what do I need to maintain in order to make that opportunity for birth more realistic and more optimal so that that can be improved. There's a lot of different layers to how you can improve your understanding of your body if you had that information available to you.
Mm-hmm. So when women who are, like, say, let's for the sake of argument talk like maybe a little bit more on fertility, because you did mention a male complement, like also like semen
Yeah. And
microbiome.
complementing
Yeah.
is a really important way to frame it, because you can do everything to it. So you have dysbiosis, vaginal microbiome can be a dysbiosis. There are ways that you can alleviate that and improve that, whether that's through specific needs that your doctor can provide, or through proper supplementation and probiotic intervention. There's ways to optimize that. But if you don't know what your partner's condition is, that there's going to be obviously pass-through. We have, for example, women are regularly testing yearly for HPV strains, but typically men don't test for that. So that's one of the key things that you can do to complement that is in order for a woman to stay and maintain full health, she really needs to understand what her male partner is doing, or, whoever your sexual partner is. Having that information can be very helpful in understanding what can we do to make sure that, any sexual experience we have is beneficial for both. So there's a lot that can be, I think, optimized within this area, whether specifically for, a couple that's trying to get pregnant, to just overall healthy living and healthy ways of interacting with each other that typically we don't even talk about right now, but it's something that should be understood and layered into the way that we approach our interaction with our partner.
Because now you're talking about the ability for a long-term emotional connection in that, in the vehicle of like the sexual intimacy. And so then, okay, so that's interesting. I never thought about that. So there's the fertility, there's the transition postmenopausal, but then there's also the longevity of intimacy in a couple. You don't often hear
Absolutely
spoken of. You do hear about, outlive and live to be 200. And, this is actually the first time I've heard this kind of spoken to in more of a, quality and intimacy and emotional connection, leveraging these tools. It's really interesting. And so, okay. So when you think about, let's say the starting point, we talked about 3 use cases, really. Do you envision this? Is this something that you're going to be in partnership with IVF clinics with, so say, for example, I'd love it if people just would, be proactive and, look for these information to, start building a long-term longitudinal map, because of, it's, you need yourself to your historicals to it's like a personal family history in your lifetime with like you as the community of selves, which is really, really interesting. And like why it's important is, like one example is like when I was an athlete, my resting heart rate was, 40, let's say at 42, right? It might not be exactly that low right now. It's maybe closer to 50, arguable to say for sure if 42 is even healthy. But the point was, when I went to get my appendix out, they're like, oh yeah, your resting heart rate is 80. You're okay. You're walking around. It's like, yeah, but like I neglected to mention that it's usually, like it didn't even ask, didn't even come up. Right?
Yeah.
And then having other information like, for example, going into a surgery and the anesthesiologist saying like, hey, do you have any drug allergies? And my running joke is, I don't know. I haven't tried them all. And I said, actually, wait a minute. I do actually have my pharmacogenetics report, and I can go through that right now. And I can apply AI to it, have a conversation with it, and I can actually tell you the relevant information within 30 seconds of you asking me that question. And so, but I couldn't do that unless I had all the data into one spot. Right? And that was the other interesting thing too, like going through this exchange and talking with all these experts, as it related to like the side effects of the mold, right? Is there's like the paralysis in or numbness in my sinus, and there was the optical migraines, and so tinnitus in one side, and there's like the burning of my skin intermittently, and and I'm telling all of these different things to different people. But what happened was I started recording all the dialogue and actually putting that in to a single source of truth, and then interrogating the data as its own kind of closed source LLM, and then starting to add in the appropriate peer-reviewed, scientific, relevant information, not just a random GPT hallucination, vulnerable partner, right? And so as it relates to the starting point of these women for live and potentially their partners, like where do you see that happening? Are you figuring that out now? Do you have partners that you're going to market with? Like, what is the kind of woman that would do this? Like, what other things might she be doing in parallel? Like, because there's a lot of there's a lot of femtech out there right now. Like, are these women that are already tracking their cycles? Are there is there a specific, I guess, group that you're thinking of starting with, or is that part of the launch experiment?
Yeah, certainly part of the launch experiment. We have an ongoing pilot study right now that's really looking holistically at the platform. So it's not only looking at, doing the testing and how the results that are coming from that for modeling, but also the platform itself, where we're helping the individual, the woman, bring in her data, whether that's data that she has brought in from other testing work that she's done or other, lab testing that she's had, where she can bring in that information. She can have a wearable, and we can integrate that wearable information into creating essentially a living model. I think that the future of personalized biology has to be considered continuous. It's alive, dynamic, and deeply individual. And yes, while ChatGPT is probably hallucinating on some levels, it's getting better and better. And there's going to become a point where we have all of that information in a way that we can model it and hone in that living model to integrate all of the layers that we've talked about. So it's not just predicting like disease anymore. It's about maintaining wellness through that awareness. So my hope is that, especially as we look at younger generations, they're much more proactive at trying to understand their bodies. It was interesting when I was in skincare, because there was this trend that talked to that people were investing more into their skincare health and cosmetic, the right types of higher end products, for example, rather than, spending their money on the latest clothesline, for example, or the, latest brand. They wanted to invest more of their free money into keeping their body healthy. And I think that trend is continuing because we have better understanding about how we can use this information to optimize our overall health, optimize our appearance that way, but just optimize healthy living so that we feel healthy when we get up each day. And I think that's a key part to the future of this, is that we're looking at ways to say personalized biology is continuous if you provide yourself a vehicle that lets you see that information and continue to see that information as things change. And when it gets nuanced enough, that's going to allow you to understand, cyclical natures, for example, for a woman, on how to maybe optimize her diet through the month, to, the greater impacts that they may have from a transition from, perimenopause into postmenopause. And how do you optimize that time period in your life so that it's, can be considered a positive experience rather than a negative. And I think that's where there's a lot of work, to your point, on femtech and otherwise, is really trying to understand that. And there is definitely a shift in that. But, I think that the transition for any person is to say, how do I go from fearing the data to enjoying understanding the data? And I think that's one of the interesting unlocks that we're looking at. I remember having a conversation with another sibling about our biological age test and all the things that we're doing. And he kind of jokingly said, well, that's not for me. I don't want to touch that. I don't want to know. And yet I don't think that comment is probably quite universal. And if someone's not necessarily doing all the health tricks that they think they should be doing, the last thing they want to know is, what's the data show? How old does it say that I am? And yet there's got to be a point where you kind of transition that into saying that the data that you can get is not something that should be considered a negative, like that you fear it. It should be something that you actually accept, to say, this is a snapshot of what's going on, but it is only a snapshot. And I think the thing that most people that on the consumer side don't understand, that we don't necessarily articulate well enough within our space, is that the science shows overwhelming evidence that you can make changes, and those changes can actually be quite dramatically quick when you make the right interventions. And so knowing that information is so important. You mentioned like the polygenic risk score analysis. Some people say they only want to know that. And the question is, if that information is available to you, it means you can create the interventions that you need to actually make a difference, so that that's not your destiny. It's actually just part of you understanding what's going on. So you have to kind of shift and tell people that biology is not destiny, it's dialogue. Your DNA is not a script you're stuck with. It's a score that changes with every note you play. When I was in skincare and educating on epigenetics, I'd often talk about your DNA blueprint is the piano. It's the keys that you have. But your epigenetics is all about playing the right notes and creating beautiful music with that. You have to learn how to play the piano in order to make a beautiful piece, a masterpiece. And that comes with understanding and knowing your data and not fearing the data.
Yeah. You mentioned that, you have a study group, a research group of women that you're working with now. And Zymo in general has a, very far-reaching research community, right? So 100 plus institutions, academic industry. What role has that played? Will that play? Could that play in this process? And maybe a little bit of background for the listeners on Zymo could be helpful, because I think there's a really interesting ecosystem that Dr. Jha has built. And, one of the things that I see is there's these current academics today who are investigating and validating these models. And, on the other side, there's companies like Epimorphy, who are commercializing them. And, those are two different talents, right? To discover and to invent, to maintain, to recalibrate, versus to commercialize, disseminate, and then the translation that has to happen in together. There's really kind of three players there. But, given what you just described in terms of, the value that this could deliver, is there a way that Zymo has or will tap into, that ecosystem of, just basically accelerating knowledge translation into the, the wellness realm?
Yeah, great question. And I think that's actually really kind of fundamental to why, when I was kind of in 2024 looking at a career change, a career transition, going from skincare back into the life science industry, part of my hard look was what kind of company do I want to be part of? And when I saw the job post for Epimorphy and kind of looked under the hood, this was exactly what I wanted because of the ecosystem that was built here. So Zymo Research, of course, is in the life science industry. Dr. Jha has built a 30-year company on his own. He's never had external investments on that. He built the infrastructure himself. But he also saw and had a vision to say that there's more that we can do here. All of this technology we've done through collaborative work with academia and otherwise to really hone in on optimizing the workflow for DNA extraction, next-gen sequencing, epigenetic analysis. We can bring that to the consumer in a real way. And so he spun out a company. It's a completely separate company called Epimorphy. But we, of course, are leveraging the science that has been backed by that 30 years of experience that he's created. And so it really creates this unique opportunity where, yes, Epimorphy is a direct-to-consumer brand where we're launching the Live brand, but we have this ecosystem that allows us to look at opportunities within, for example, the IVT fertility space, where we have opportunities to look at ways of collaborating with the doctors in a meaningful way. And so I'm really excited about the overall ecosystem that's here. And it was the biggest draw to why I chose to come here was because of that opportunity of saying, how do we continue to model this information so that it's a living engine that we're building that goes along with the information that our consumers are going to be providing through the platform. We want to create an ecosystem that allows us to provide them the information, get feedback from how their interventions are having an impact on, whether it's positive or negative, that we can model with that, and then continue to feed that into optimizing the overall modeling and the way that we can look at that. And that's largely driven through that academic backbone that we have through the Zymo research team.
Mm-hmm. Do you envision like formal partnerships? So, for example, you've got a Sean Gibbons partnership. I guess he's probably. I don't know if this. I mean, he potentially has been, or I guess he's more digital with his models. But Well, I mean, I think he could be a Zymo customer probably in his research at some
Yeah.
point. Okay, so that is an example of you working with a researcher that uses Zymo products and building this into. Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And
Right. Oh, well,
Dr. Shah has
sure.
always been a visionary with that in the context of
Mhm,
interacting with academia, providing testing services, kits, all in
mhm,
pursuit of academic questions, of answering those questions. What they unlock from an information standpoint is critical to the pursuit of a D2C company. Without that information, without providing the tools, the resources to academia, we can't get to the point that we have now of saying, how do we create this unique model for the consumer that can provide the scientific information in a way that they can interpret well, that they can understand, and it can be impactful to their lives? And so I kind of envision the Live platform as that medium that allows us to take all of the scientific knowledge and put it in the right way into the consumer's hands in a way that they can actually take advantage of this scientific information. That's what gets me excited. That's why I wanted to do this particular opportunity, was because of that interconnection.
got it. Okay, so this is like, so whereas 23andMe was just your genetics, you're thinking about things from, well, a completely different vantage point insofar as being consumer centric, first of all, and but much more robust insofar as the kinds of data, as you mentioned, epigenetics, microbiomics, genetics, and then being able to plug in the the models that are on the frontier that are evidence-based, like your Sean Givens, like your, like Los Bustamante, actually a previous guest. He's got, impressive PRS models that he's corrected for ancestry on.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And you
And then
think about
there's,
all of those models are fantastic because they provide some really fundamental understanding, but we had to have a way of creating a model that allows you to actually interplay with all three. You have your genetics, epigenetics, and microbiome. And if you can have a path that can interplay all of those together, it can unlock information that we don't know yet how much that interaction, what that story is really telling. The gut microbiome, for example, the popularity of it right now is quite high, but our understanding of like what makes a perfect gut microbiome is still to be told. We don't know that yet. And part of it is because we haven't created that interaction in a way that helps us to model and understand that in a way that can be unlocked through these kind of projects and R&D research that we're doing.
yeah. See, so that actually gets us quite naturally to that question that I put at the beginning, which was, what if we had this colloquium of all these people that were, because, we have all these conversations and we're connecting asynchronously, but then we all go back to our silos and we do our things and we're under different constraints and deadlines. And, I think about like, what would happen if, there was a space and time where there was, you, Dr. Jha, Nathan Price, Dr. Lee Hood, Dr. Sean Givens, Raghav, Mike, Okari, and Epigenetics CEO, sequencing CEO. Like there's so many people that if like put together their different pieces to serve like, one customer, let's say focus group. Because I think I shared this with you and I've been sharing with a few, guests as we're approaching episode 100. I was saying at the beginning of the call is like, well, what are we doing all this? And it seems to me that there's some value in connecting people. And so I want to keep doing that. But then how can we do it beyond virtual and listeners on the podcast? And so if we could do a day like that, like what would your idea be? Like what would help Live? What would help Zymo? Like it's blue ocean right now, brainstorm phase, but like, how would you envision something like that as a colloquium of ushering in the age of scientific wellness, let's say?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned earlier the biomarkers aging consortium that happened in Boston a few weeks ago that we were surprised. Hey, we have this like the DNA of Things podcast listeners and people who have been part of your past episodes get together, and it was a lot of fun. But I think it just drives to the point that what you've done here in the podcast has created a lot of really compelling stories that have ultimately led to a lot of interactions. And a consortium would obviously create the benefit of doing that in face-to-face and having those interactions. I was just actually on a call yesterday with Ryan from one of your podcasts previously with Avexia Diagnostics. And we've had a great interaction over the last 3 months. And part of that's been driven through a first introduction when I reached out to him after his podcast. And we've just carried on the dialogue and have a relationship that's moving forward with some of the tests that we have in the Zymo ecosystems and bringing that onto their platform. So there's already ample evidence that those interactions can be very meaningful and very beneficial. And creating a consortium where we get together, I think this is a no-brainer within that context. So I've already mentioned that we'd be happy to help with sponsoring that. And I think that there's a great opportunity within that space of creating something very unique and compelling.
Amazing. And so that's amazing. Thank you so much for that offer. I definitely love to think about that more and co-develop that with you. And I want to just in terms of location, what would your preference be?
You already know that one because I told you this before.
I didn't want to assume. I knew that you said Halifax before, but I didn't want to put you on the spot in case that wasn't true. But now I know it is.
It is. Okay. It was one of my saddest parts is I was set to go to Halifax in fall of 2024, but that was with hydropeptide, but I ended up leaving before that took place. And so Halifax has been on my bucket list. That time of year is a beautiful time. So, maybe, September of 2026, maybe that's the right timing for this as well. Get a great excuse to go and see the beautiful area that you live in. And of course, you've already mentioned enough on the podcast how there's some really innovative stuff going on Halifax. I think it's worthy to put it on the map in that regard as well.
Yeah, it's true. There's and I know Canada's launched a big whole genome sequencing initiative as well. So I think that it could be. And I think we talked about this before. Whereas Oswald Avery is from Halifax, the guy that proved DNA, the heritable material of life. And so I think there's kind of a cool ode that we might do that. And okay, well, thank you for those ideas. That's definitely I've made note of that. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I know that since you've listened to every episode, what comes at the end, and that's the 3 questions, right? And
I do.
I asked them at the end because I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that comes out in these conversations that I can't plan for. I can only plan to hold the space. And so anyway, those 3 questions are, number one, if there was one core message that came from this call, this interaction today, what is it? That's number 1. And number 2 is who needs to hear it? And then number 3, if you could nominate my next guest, and you've already been so gracious in recommending guests previously. If you're out of people, I would understand, but those are my 3 questions.
No, I actually have a unique route for nominations, so I do give that some thought beforehand. But so if this were my last podcast, what would I want? What do I want to say to the listeners? I think it's just what I've said before, that the message I leave behind is simple. It's your biology listens. It's never too late to start listening back. And this is our opportunity in this day and age where we have the access to information on genetics, epigenetics, and microbiome to start listening better to what's going on. And so that's my recommendation, is to go and listen to your body and understand it better. So when I say, who do you hope this message reaches, I would say the same thing. It's for all the people who hesitate, the ones who say, I don't want to know. While the hesitation is understandable, it's also the moment that can change everything. Once you see your biology clearly, you realize it's not a judgment. It's an invitation to take part in your own evolution. I think that's the heart of what I'm trying to build at Live. I've always, I was a runner in high school. I loved to be healthy. Not that I've always been healthy, but one of the things that this has really unlocked for me in the past year, both listening to your podcast and then what I've been trying to do with this platform, is I've been listening to my body in ways that I just didn't know I could do before. And the exciting thing is that I know there's things I can learn that I haven't learned yet by listening. And so I hope that people take away that fear and just say, I want to understand. I don't want to hesitate to know. And that's where I think is really important. Now, for the last question, who would you nominate next for the podcast? One of the things, Jeremy, that I've loved about your podcast is that you have, with the DNA of things, have had quite a variety of people on, and they've had interesting topics. The person who I want to nominate is Dr. Quinn Peterson from the Mayo Clinic. Quinn is doing pioneering work in type 1 diabetes. So this is a nod back to some of the things that I had passionate. He and I had our first kids right at the same time. He had a girl, I had a boy. And we were at the University of Illinois, and his daughter actually developed type 1 diabetes. It kind of created a career change in his career path. But he's embodied the intersection of research and real life in that way. So he's someone that isn't just studying biology, he's living it. And that's exactly what the DNA of things is all about. So I think he'd be a great candidate for you to have on and to listen to his story.
Amazing. Well, we will reach out and extend the invitation. Thank you so much for, suggesting him. And thank you so much for your message today of empowerment. And again, thank you so much, Neal, for taking the time today. It's, as I mentioned, long overdue. And you know what? I'm already looking forward to the next time. Thank you.
I am as well. It's always great to chat with you, Jeremy, and it's a pleasure to be on. So thank you for the invite.
Well, if you've been listening, I think you'll agree that your biology listens. And if there is one signal to extract from the noise of modern health advice, it really is that simple, profound truth that Dr. Kitchen left us with today. We often treat our bodies like machines that need fixing, and sometimes they do, or black boxes that we are afraid to open. But Neal reminds us that the genome is more like a piano. The keys, that is your DNA, well, they're fixed, but the music, that is the epigenetics, that is the melody you play through your daily habits, your environment, and your mindset. Whether you're a scientist, an athlete, or a parent, the takeaway is the same. You're not a passenger in your own body, and you are the conductor. If you enjoyed this exploration of this dynamic blueprint, I encourage you to look back on our conversations with Dr. Joe Handelsman on the invisible world of the microbiome, or Dr. Nathan Price on the digital twin. And you'll see that, well, Neal's work is a critical pillar in this cathedral of ideas we are building. The move here is from reactive sick care to proactive participatory health. To dive deeper into Dr. Kitchen's work with Epimorphy and the Live platform, Enzymo Research, check out the show notes for links and resources. And finally, the question to carry with you this week: if your biology is listening to every choice you make, what are you telling it to do? I am Dr. Jeremy Koenig. Thank you for being a part of this great conversation.